so much for the invitation to be here today. I'm thrilled to be back in my home department, even though I haven't gone too far away in some ways, because I work at U of T. But nice as these invitations are, they're also kind of a sign that you've reached a certain age in your life when people start asking you to talk about your experience. And while I may be at a certain age, I'm not old enough to have forgotten the skepticism that I felt when I was sitting in your seats and had to listen to various inspirational speeches from people. After all, everything I've heard about you and your generation, you just have to open any magazine to know that you are far more dedicated, focused, talented, and driven than I or my generation ever was. So perhaps your skepticism is very well founded today. So I stand here before you, admittedly, somewhat of an unlikely success, if we define success as being that I am fortunate enough to be engaged in meaningful, interesting work in support of a mission-driven organization, U of T. So that is my personal definition of success. It's not about what kind of car I drive or anything like that. It is really, as I say, having the benefit of meaningful work and feeling valued and recognized in the work that I do. So even if you take what I say with a grain of salt, when I talk about my personal experience, I'll share with you, sort of at the conclusion of my remarks, a little bit about what I hear from our graduates around the world. Because as was mentioned, I serve as AVP for Alumni Relations, so in that role, I get to meet with alumni all over the world. I get to hear about their experiences, and I'll share some of that with you, so you don't have to take my word for it. You can take the word of our alumni. So how did I get here? I was a kid from Hamilton. I came here in the 80s. I was a first generation student who came to U of T. My parents came here post World War II. My father fought with the Allied forces, landed in, he joined when he was 17, village was basically invaded by the Russians. So he ran away, joined the Allied forces in England, and arrived here in 1947, having not having gone, I think, beyond, grade 10 or 11. He worked at Stelco for 37 years, and I remember many things about my dad, but the thing that I remember most is the fact that he told me from the time I could remember, the most important thing is for you to get an education. You have to get an education so you can be somebody. And I realized, that was a reflection of his experience as someone who worked in an interesting labor environment, someone whose English wasn't his first language, probably experienced all kinds of discrimination and so on. And that was, so his sense of education being linked to, personhood was actually really, quite profound to me, particularly in retrospect. So the fact that I came from this background had this, great emphasis on education as I was growing up. Have I just disconnected them?
No, just put it back on. Or leave it.
There we go. The fact that I studied political science, and I did a double major, political science and literary studies, was a bit of an act of outrageous optimism, I suppose, because I probably should have been on a much more linear path to a clear job. And maybe you're thinking, well, back then you could study things like that because tuition was cheaper and, it wasn't as hard as it is now. Well, in some ways that's true. Tuition was cheaper, but for my family, it was not an insignificant investment. And it was a time of a certain looking back almost at times for cheerful nihilism. The Sex Pistols released God Save the Queen in 1977. By the time I came to school in the early 80s, we all danced to God Save the Queen, and we'd all cheerfully sing the No Future closing refrain of that song, not really realizing the full irony of that, but it was interesting. Interest rates when I graduated were just around 12% for a 5-year mortgage, so real estate seems a little cheaper in retrospect, but interest rates were very, very high. So every generation faces its challenges, and certainly my generation felt that it faced its share of challenges. So I came here and was completely unprepared for what I discovered. I really didn't know what to expect, and what cemented my decision to study political science was an introductory course I took. I think it was POL 104 with Professor Thomas Pangle, and it was a political philosophy course. And like I said, I was a kid from Hamilton with pretty narrow perspective, and I had never heard anyone be so provocative and so challenging of almost every assumption that I held dear. And I will always remember that first lecture, and I walked out of that class and I knew that this was a path that I had to follow. And in fact, my emphasis in political science was political philosophy, and I have to say it was one of the more challenging things I ever did. I routinely felt completely lost, humiliated, and challenged, and in retrospect I wouldn't change any of it, because it, without that kind of pain and suffering, if you will, you realize that you don't really learn or achieve anything in life. And it was an incredibly rich experience. So what did political science do for me? It taught me how to think critically. It gave me the courage to challenge assumptions that I held dear, that others held dear. It gave me an appreciation for rigor, and gave me an appreciation for hard work. What was my path when I left here? Well, when I left, I decided that I wanted to pursue graduate studies. But before I did that, I felt like I wanted to, this was still during the time of the Cold War, so I felt that I wanted to perfect some of my language skills. So I actually went to the Jagiellonian University in Kraków in Poland for a couple of years and was studying Polish and Russian. And it was a fascinating time to be there because, for those of you who know your history, martial law had been imposed in the early 80s in Poland, and when I was there in the second half of the 80s, it was a time of the Solidarity movement, and a lot of the push toward glasnost was really being fueled by the Solidarity movement in Poland. So it was a time when there was a lot of dissent that was very public, which was unheard of in this communist state. The priests were preaching dissent from the pulpit. There was incredible intellectual ferment going on. A lot of magazines that were, supposed to be underground magazines, but they were very public. There was a lot of subversive theater. It was a fascinating time to be there. Unfortunately, before the Iron Curtain came down, things got a little tense in Poland, and it did look as if martial law might be imposed again. So I came back and was going to pursue graduate studies when I ended up getting 3 job offers just through various connections that I had actually made while I was a student here. One of them was to be a research assistant to a blind man named Milton. If anyone knows anything about the author of Paradise Lost, he was also Milton, and he was blind. And so that struck me as a rather an interesting irony. I didn't take that role, but I did work for a public affairs program that was run out of the St. Lawrence Center. We organized live public debates on issues of concern to the city. It was a job that paid $12,000 a year, and it, at that time, wasn't really enough to live on, but it seemed like a small fortune after being a student, and it was a tremendous education to everything that was going on in this city, and what the key issues were. And it was really democracy in action in a very participatory way, in practice, after having learned about it in theory and in political science. I've had a variety of jobs. I was in the Naval Reserves for a few years, and I don't know if I can still do it, but I used to be able to assemble and disassemble the official NATO force weapon, not quite blindfolded, but just about. While I was a student, I worked as a cleaner in residences. I've worked as a fundraiser. I've worked in public relations in theater. I've worked in support of vice presidents at the University of Toronto, and eventually ended up in alumni relations, and that's where I am today, obviously. So, one of the enduring lessons I think that I take away, and it's really that I took away from my education, that really only became apparent to me in retrospect, was the importance and power of narrative, and both in the workforce, in the political arena, and also in the sphere of your own personal development. I think it's only in times when you have to make choices in your life that you recognize really the power of narrative and the fact that you are the author of your own story. And while this may seem trite at this point, one of the things that I took away from literary studies was the power of naming. And once you name something, once you put a story around something, it takes on a reality. And you have the power to do that in the way that you start to tell your story to both your professors, to people that you meet, and the way that you discover other people's stories. And I think one of the challenges today is that when I think about what it must be like to be in the shoes of someone who's either studying or is just about to graduate, is there are so many people have appropriated the narrative of your generation, if you will. Everyone's talking about how difficult the economy is, how difficult it is for students to make their way in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And don't get me wrong, I mean, we face a lot of challenges in this world, but we also have, I think, more means at our disposal than perhaps we ever had before to address those challenges. And at the root, I think, is education. And I think that no matter what path you decide to choose, no one can take that away from you. No one can take your education away from you, and no one can take the skills and the strengths that you will take away from this experience. And you will be able to use those to create your story going forward. So thank you for letting me share my story with you today. I hope you find it helpful. And I'll just close, as I said, by just sharing a little bit with you from what I hear from our graduates. I wonder if the graduate that you were talking about is Roland Paris, because I was just... Yeah, he's another one. He just had an op-ed piece in the Globe, I think on Tuesday night, which was very, very interesting. He runs the equivalent of the Monk School at the University of Ottawa. He's a poli-sci grad, Moss Scholar from here. I don't know if he went on to get the Rhodes, but I know he started off with the Moss Scholarship. But what I hear from our alumni, and these are people in Toronto and around the world who've gone on to do such incredible things, and many of whom did not follow linear paths to get where they are. And if I had to kind of characterize what I hear from them into thematic areas, I think the two themes would be how hard it was. Everyone talks about how rigorous and challenging their experience was, but I have not yet met anyone who says, I wished it had been easier. Everyone says that it was so hard and so challenging, but the benefit of that was that no matter where they went, either for graduate school or what field they went into, they felt that they could hold their own, and they felt far better prepared than many of their peers. And they, in addition to that, they felt that the reputation of the university was something that raised their own value when others knew where they studied. The second thematic area that their comments would fall into, especially those who are in the position of being employers, and most recently, the partner of a Vancouver law firm shared this with the president during a conversation in Vancouver just last week. And the second common theme is we're not looking, when I hire, I'm not looking for job-ready graduates. I'm not looking for people who have been prepared to do a particular job. The workforce based on, these are our alumni talking, the workforce based on what I've seen in my career is so dynamic, it's constantly evolving. The idea that I would want to hire someone who's trained to do one specific thing, it makes absolutely no sense. We hear this all the time that we need people who know how to think. And that is so true, because the nature of the challenges, the nature of the problems are changing all the time. And we need people who can adapt to that and who can solve problems no matter what the circumstances are. And in that sense, university graduates and graduates who are coming from humanities and social sciences programs are highly desirable in that regard. So I leave those words with you from some of our graduates, and again, just thank you for your time and attention, and I think I have 2 minutes and 50 seconds to spare, so